It was supposed to be just another gala, another evening where the rich and powerful smiled through their teeth, their laughter echoing through lavish halls. But in the midst of crystal glasses and gentle music, something happened. A single, quiet moment that would set the stage for a battle that would change everything. The evening had all the hallmarks of perfection. Crystal glasses clinking, the soft hum of quiet conversations blending into the background, and the smooth flow of delicate, expensive wine. The opulence of the room was undeniable, from the golden chandeliers that bathed everything in a warm glow to the meticulously arranged silverware on each table, placed with precision. Guests in tailored tuxedos and glamorous gowns filled the space, their laughter light and refined as if choreographed. Yet beneath the elegance, there was an air of underlying tension, a feeling that something was bound to break the facade. Elena moved gracefully among the guests, her uniform immaculate, her steps careful. She had worked in these kinds of events before, but tonight felt different. Her mind wasn't on the clinking of glasses or the soft murmur of polite conversation. It was elsewhere. Her thoughts kept drifting back to her mother, lying in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life, her treatment growing more expensive by the day. Elena had become accustomed to the dismissive stares of the wealthy. To them, she was nothing more than a shadow in the background, a mere part of the decor that existed only to serve their whims. But that was fine. She didn't need recognition, just the paycheck that would help pay for her mother's care. As she approached the table with the main course, Elena's heart raced slightly, not because of the meal, but because the stakes of the evening felt higher than usual. She had done this hundreds of times before, never once faltering in her task. But this time, as she steadied her breath and moved to serve, something felt off. Perhaps it was the weight of her exhaustion, or the quiet fear of her mother's declining health that hung over her like a dark cloud. She placed the plate in front of a distinguished guest, careful not to make any noise. But just as she turned to leave, disaster struck. The glass of wine, perched precariously at the edge of the table, tipped over, the deep red liquid spilling across the polished floor and splashing onto the shoes of none other than Gustavo, one of the most powerful businessmen in the room. He was a man who had built his empire through hard work, but also through ruthless tactics, treating people as tools to climb higher. The sound of the glass shattering seemed to echo through the entire room. Elena froze in horror. A sudden wave of embarrassment washed over her, the blood draining from her face. She knew it wasn't the end of the world, that it was a simple mistake, nothing more than a spilled drink. But in the world she lived in, where every misstep was magnified under the scrutinizing eyes of the powerful, this was something far worse than a mere mistake. This was a chance for her to be crushed, to be reminded of just how invisible she truly was. Gustavo stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a noise that was somehow more jarring than the crash of the glass. The room fell silent in an instant, all eyes turning toward him. Elena felt every pair of eyes land on her, a weight she couldn't escape. She had never felt so small. With an expression that bordered on rage, Gustavo's voice cracked through the silence. "Are you out of your mind?" he barked, his words sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. "How do you manage to mess up something so simple? You had one job: serve the food. Is that too much to ask?" His tone was venomous, filled with contempt, his words stinging harder than any physical blow could have. Elena's stomach twisted in knots. She had braced herself for this moment. The disdain of the elite was something she had long accepted. Yet, hearing the fury in Gustavo's voice felt different. His anger wasn't just about the wine, it was about something deeper. It was a power struggle, a reminder that she was beneath him, that her purpose was nothing more than to serve. She lowered her head, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands shook as she offered a quick apology, her voice barely a whisper. It didn't matter though. Gustavo wasn't done. No, his anger was like an unstoppable force, a tidal wave crashing against the fragile dam of decorum that held the evening together. "You think you can just walk around here ruining everything you touch?" Gustavo sneered. "You can't even serve a simple meal without making a mess. Do you even know what you're doing?" He stepped closer, looming over her like a predator sizing up its prey. The room was completely still, the guests unsure of how to react. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others watched with an almost morbid fascination, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding before them. But Elena didn't cower. She had endured far worse than this in silence, years of judgment, of being treated like a nonentity. She had grown used to it. But this time, something shifted within her. Her eyes lifted slowly, and for the first time that evening she held his gaze, not with fear but with something else, something stronger. Her lips pressed together, her chest tightening as she fought to keep her composure. Without a word, she took a deep breath, allowing the humiliation to wash over her, but not consume her. And then she said the words that would mark the turning point of the night. "Thank you for reminding me that even in the most luxurious places, humanity is the scarcest commodity." The words hung in the air, cold and cutting, and for a brief moment the entire room fell silent. Even Gustavo, who had been so full of rage moments earlier, faltered. His expression shifted slightly, a mix of confusion, surprise and something else he couldn't quite name. But he quickly recovered, laughing it off with a sarcastic chuckle. He turned back to his seat, his arrogance unshaken by Elena's quiet defiance. The guests, though still tense, awkwardly tried to move past the moment, nervously resuming their conversation, but the air had changed. Something had shifted. And as the evening continued, no one could forget the quiet dignity that Elena had shown in the face of such public cruelty. The atmosphere in the room remained thick with tension. Elena stood motionless, still at the edge of the table, her heart racing as she processed the impact of her words. Though she had spoken with defiance, her hands were trembling slightly, betraying the calm exterior she had worked so hard to maintain. Her mind wasn't on the mocking laughter that still lingered in the air. Her thoughts were far away with her mother, who was fighting for breath in a sterile hospital room, thousands of miles from the luxury of this gala. But in this moment, her world had shifted. The pain and humiliation she had endured over the years, hidden behind every polite nod, every silent apology, suddenly seemed less significant. She had done something that felt like the beginning of reclaiming her voice. The guests resumed their conversations, but the laughter was hollow, the air still vibrating with the sharp sting of what had just happened. Elena could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she refused to flinch. No more hiding. She wasn't a servant here, not anymore. Gustavo, on the other hand, appeared unfazed by the drama he had caused. He settled back into his chair, a self-satisfied smirk creeping across his face, though his eyes darted nervously toward the other guests. He had lived a life where his wealth and power shielded him from consequences, where those beneath him simply bowed their heads and moved out of his way. Tonight he had expected the same. An underling would make a mistake, apologize and quietly disappear into the background. But Elena hadn't bowed. And that, more than anything, was something he couldn't ignore. His eyes narrowed as he looked across the room, his mind working furiously. How dare she speak to him like that? He was used to being the one who controlled the narrative, who dictated the actions of everyone around him. And yet, here was this woman, this servant, as he had so scornfully reminded her, looking him straight in the eyes, daring him to retaliate. His mind reeled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. But Elena wasn't finished. She didn't turn away, didn't look down. Instead, she stood tall, her chin lifted slightly, a silent challenge in her eyes. She had spoken her truth, and nothing in the world could make her take it back. Meanwhile, in the back of the room, a quiet figure observed it all with sharp eyes. Camila, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, had been watching Elena from the moment she entered the room. At first, Camila had appeared like any other guest, engaged in polite conversation, a subtle observer of the social dynamics in play. But the moment Gustavo had exploded, she had seen something in Elena's response that no one else in the room did. There was a quiet strength in the young woman's gaze, a refusal to let herself be crushed. Camila knew better than most what it meant to be underestimated. She was no stranger to the way powerful men often dismissed women like Elena, relegating them to the background, their voices silenced by the weight of their wealth. But as an internal auditor for Gustavo's company, Camila also knew something else. She knew the power of knowledge, the importance of quiet observation, and the value of seeing beyond the surface. And what she saw in Elena was something that caught her attention. It wasn't just the defiance, it was the dignity behind it, the quiet strength that resonated beneath the embarrassment. Camila had no idea what had prompted Elena to stand her ground in such a bold way, but she could feel that something larger was at play here. As the evening wore on, Elena's mind kept returning to her mother, her fragile, ailing mother, whose only wish was to see her daughter succeed. The thought of her kept Elena grounded. But as she gazed around the room, it became clearer that the world she inhabited, this world of wealth and privilege, wasn't a place that cared about people like her. She wasn't a part of their world. She was a shadow, a servant, there only to do the things they couldn't be bothered to do themselves. And yet, despite all of that, Elena had just shown a flicker of something even more powerful than any wealth or social status. Her own sense of worth. Minutes passed, but the air in the room had thickened. The guests, once engaged in their hushed conversations, now seemed distracted, uneasy. Elena had become the focal point of a moment far bigger than her role in the evening. The energy shifted as people began to whisper to one another, glancing nervously toward the woman who had dared to stand up to their host. Gustavo, ever the master of control, was beginning to lose his composure. He hadn't expected this reaction. No one had stood up to him like this in years. And the worst part was it wasn't just the wine. It was everything Elena represented, the audacity to speak out, the courage to challenge a system that sought to keep her down. For the first time that evening, Gustavo felt his invincibility crack. But he wouldn't admit it. Not yet. The tension in the air remained unbroken. Elena continued with her duties, no longer feeling like a mere shadow in the room. She walked among the guests, head held high, as if she had found a new kind of power in herself. But inside, a storm raged. She was fighting more than just the humiliation from earlier. She was fighting for something bigger. Dignity, respect, and the belief that she, too, had the right to exist as more than a servant. Minutes later, Elena was pulled away from the dinner service and escorted to the kitchen by one of the supervisors. "There's been an incident," he explained awkwardly, unsure of how to handle the situation. "Gustavo doesn't want any more disturbances. Go clean yourself up." Elena nodded silently, not protesting. She wasn't angry anymore, she was beyond that. Her face remained stoic as she stepped out of the main dining area and into the quiet of the kitchen. Her uniform, now stained and ruined by Gustavo's cruel outburst, felt like a symbol of everything she had endured in her life. She didn't clean her face. She didn't wipe away the sauce or the pasta. She stood there, gathering her thoughts. Back in the dining hall, things were escalating quickly. As Elena walked away from the scene, Camila's eyes never left her. Camila had seen enough. The kitchen was quiet, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the gala. Elena leaned against the counter, her mind still spinning from what had just transpired. The cool air of the kitchen felt like a relief, far from the tension in the banquet hall, away from the piercing stares and judgmental whispers. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her, grounding her in the reality of her situation. Yet, as much as she tried to push it away, her thoughts kept circling back to Gustavo's cruel words and the shock of the public humiliation. But amidst the chaos, one thought held firm: she was still standing. No matter how he tried to break her, she had not bowed, not once. Elena knew she had to get back out there, even if just for a few minutes. There was a part of her that needed to feel seen, needed to show that she wasn't just an invisible worker in their world of luxury. Not today. Just as Elena was about to gather herself, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a voice she hadn't expected to hear broke through the silence. "Elena, we need to talk." It was Camila. Elena hadn't seen her approach, but her presence seemed to carry an authority that even Elena could not ignore. Camila's sharp, focused eyes studied her for a moment before she spoke again. "You handled yourself well in there," Camila said, her voice calm but firm. "Better than I would have expected anyone to handle such a situation." Elena didn't respond immediately. She was too stunned, too caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the woman who, until now, had seemed just another face in the crowd. Camila had been watching, observing her every move. Elena could feel it. The woman's gaze wasn't just curious, it was calculating. "I've seen that look before," Camila continued, taking a step closer to Elena. "The look of someone who's been pushed down so long, they've forgotten how to stand up for themselves." Camila's words cut deeper than Elena expected. "But you did more than stand up. You showed them that you weren't afraid." Elena felt a surge of emotion rise within her, a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly, the words coming out in a half-whisper. Camila smiled faintly, a knowing look in her eyes. "I'm not doing this for you, Elena. I'm doing this because what happened in that room wasn't just about wine spilling or a misplaced mistake. It was about power, abuse of power. And I'm not the kind of person who stands idly by when I see it." The weight of Camila's words settled on Elena's shoulders. For the first time, Elena realized that someone in this world, someone with influence and power, saw her. Really saw her. Camila wasn't just a bystander to the events, she was someone who understood the larger picture, someone who could make things happen. "You deserve more than this," Camila said softly, almost to herself. "And you won't have to stay invisible any longer." As Camila spoke, Elena began to understand the deeper implications of what had just happened. It wasn't just the humiliation that would haunt her, it was the moment itself. For the first time, she had faced the embodiment of everything she had been forced to endure, and she hadn't broken. But the night wasn't over. And for Gustavo, the consequences were just beginning. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the air had shifted dramatically. Guests, once focused on their laughter and small talk, now found themselves whispering, exchanging glances. What had started as a minor mishap had turned into a spectacle, one that would be remembered long after the evening was over. Elena's quiet strength had left a mark on them, and they couldn't help but feel uneasy. At the head of the room, Gustavo was oblivious to the shift in perception. He had retaken his seat, his expression smug as he tried to shake off the earlier incident. To him, it was just another bump in the road, a small inconvenience that he would ignore and continue his evening. He didn't care about Elena. To him, she was nothing more than a cog in his grand machine, easily replaced if necessary. But Camila knew something that Gustavo didn't. She knew that what had just transpired was far more than a momentary lapse of control. It was a test, one that he had failed. And Camila had a plan. The clock ticked on, and just as the last traces of tension began to fade from the room, Camila stood up from her seat. She straightened her dress, glancing over at the two suited men who had followed her into the hall. Their presence was unassuming, but their purpose was clear. They were there to ensure that Gustavo faced the consequences of his actions. Without a word, Camila began to walk toward the head of the table. Every step she took seemed deliberate, measured, as if she were walking toward something far greater than just an awkward confrontation. The guests watched, curious but uncertain of what was to come. Gustavo noticed her approach and his face tightened. His gaze flicked nervously between Camila and the men she had brought with her. For the first time that evening, he felt the weight of something heavier than his arrogance, a quiet, creeping fear that seemed to settle in his chest. "Camila, this isn't the time for one of your inspections," Gustavo said, his voice faltering slightly. He was trying to maintain control, but it was slipping from his grasp. His usual self-assured demeanor was now cracking, revealing a vulnerability he rarely showed. Camila's eyes locked with his. "Oh, it's more than just an inspection, Gustavo," she said, her voice steady and cold. "It's a reckoning." The room fell silent. Guests stopped whispering, unsure of what would happen next. The atmosphere, once filled with laughter, now hung heavy with anticipation. The tension in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. The guests watched in stunned silence as Camila moved with purpose, each step carrying the weight of the words that would soon shatter the comfortable facade Gustavo had built for himself. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of inevitability, as though the very walls of the room knew what was about to happen. Gustavo's eyes darted between the two men beside Camila and the guests seated around the table. He could feel the shift in the room, the eyes now turned on him, no longer with respect or admiration, but with a silent judgment. His once unshakable confidence began to crumble, piece by piece. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Camila, this is absurd. I don't have time for your theatrics." His words were desperate, a final attempt to maintain control over the situation, but they fell flat. Camila didn't flinch. She stood before him, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. The guests watched, entranced by the unfolding drama, sensing that this was no longer about a spilled drink or a moment of misplaced anger. It was about something much larger. It was about the power dynamics that had been quietly woven into the fabric of the evening and, in a moment of defiance, had been exposed. One of the men accompanying Camila stepped forward, handing Gustavo a sealed envelope. He took it hesitantly, his hands trembling slightly as he broke the seal. His eyes scanned the document quickly, his face contorting with confusion and then, slowly, with horror. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath. The words on the paper were enough to strip away any semblance of control he had left. His expression faltered, his skin pale as the realization sank in. Elena had been right. His arrogance, his cruelty, had been witnessed, and the evidence had been captured. The footage from the security cameras that had been installed at Camila's request earlier that day had recorded everything. His outburst, the humiliation of Elena, and, more damning than anything else, his entire attitude toward the staff, his blatant disregard for those who worked for him. It was all there, every word, every action, documented and ready to be made public. The same public image he had worked so hard to build, an image of power, sophistication, and invincibility, was now on the verge of crumbling. "You're finished, Gustavo," Camila's voice rang out, cold and final. "We've seen everything. Your actions, your words, they've been recorded and they will be released." The room was silent, each guest caught in the gravity of the moment. The murmurs started slowly, almost as if no one dared to speak above a whisper. But the whispers were growing louder, the ripples of shock spreading like wildfire through the crowd. They had all been complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in maintaining Gustavo's image. But now that image was about to shatter and there was no turning back. Gustavo, his once powerful figure now hunched and trembling, looked around at the guests. The faces that had once admired him now seemed distant, disinterested. The veneer of respect he had once commanded was gone, replaced by cold indifference. It was as though the room itself had turned its back on him, the very walls echoing the truth he had tried so desperately to suppress. "You can't do this," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. This is a mistake." Camilla's expression softened for a moment, but only for a brief second. "No, Gustavo. This is what happens when you forget what it means to be human. You think power makes you untouchable, but it doesn't. It just makes your fall harder." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some of them exchanging nervous glances. There was a growing sense that the evening had already changed, perhaps irrevocably. No longer were they at a celebratory dinner. No longer were they on the periphery of a social game. They were witnesses to the destruction of a man's empire, a destruction that was unfolding before their eyes. As if on cue, one of the executives from Gustavo's company rose from his seat and walked over to the table where he stood. The man's face was devoid of any sympathy, his voice even. "Gustavo, we have no choice but to terminate your position," he said, handing him a small, official-looking envelope. "You'll need to leave immediately." Gustavo stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, trying to find a way out. He had lived his life on his terms, never answering to anyone, never bending to the will of the people he considered beneath him. And now, in front of all these people, he was being stripped of everything he held dear. His title, his power, his reputation, all of it was being torn away in front of him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. "Please," he pleaded, his voice low and desperate. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It was a mistake. I was frustrated. Please don't do this." But it was too late. The weight of his actions had already caught up with him. His once ironclad control had shattered like glass, and no amount of pleading could undo the damage. As Gustavo stood there, his back hunched in shame, Elena's figure reappeared at the doorway. She had been waiting, silently, her heart still heavy from the events of the evening. But when she saw the scene unfolding before her, when she saw the power dynamics shift in an instant, something inside her clicked. She had been part of something larger than herself. The weight of injustice had finally been acknowledged. And it wasn't by her hands alone. The silence that followed her entrance was palpable, thick with the realization that everything had changed. Elena walked forward, her eyes steady as she met Gustavo's defeated gaze. For a moment, time seemed to slow, as if the entire room held its breath. "I'm not interested in revenge," Elena said, her voice calm and clear. "I just want justice." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the room seem even quieter. "And that, Gustavo, is something you'll never be able to buy." Gustavo looked at her, his eyes wide with the recognition of his complete defeat. The man who had once stood at the top of his world, untouchable, now found himself powerless, vulnerable, and utterly broken. The guests, those who had once smiled at his every word, now looked at him with disdain, their earlier admiration replaced by the cold realization of who he truly was. The applause didn't come for him. It came for Elena. And so, as the evening drew to a close, a new chapter began. Elena, who had walked into the room as a servant, left with a new sense of self-worth. She was no longer the invisible woman behind the scenes. She had claimed her place not through revenge but through her unyielding dignity. As she walked out of the room, Camila at her side, there was a sense of quiet triumph. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, nothing worth having ever was, but Elena now had something far more valuable than any paycheck or title. She had respect, and most importantly, she had reclaimed her voice. As the doors closed behind them, the last sound that echoed through the room was not the clink of glasses, but the soft applause that continued to reverberate in the hearts of those who had witnessed the true power of dignity over arrogance. Gustavo's fall was inevitable, but it was Elena's rise that would be remembered.